Hey, we're back. So I've done more reading. A little bit of context for what's going on now is I'm starting a new job next week, and it's got quite a long commute involved. And I'm planning on using that as a means to get a lot of reading done. I did a test commute this morning, and as anticipated, it was long, but it means I did do a fair bit of reading with some very useful takeaways from that. So I'm going to discuss a little bit about those. So the reading I was doing is more of Metz and Semiotics, which I mentioned in a previous video. I'll put a link in the description if anyone cares about that kind of thing for that previous video, but it's just more of me waffling about a thing I read. Also, in other news, before I get into what I've pulled from this today, I have started using TikTok as well. In much the same way as I'm using this to get to grips with the format and to involve myself with it and not just observe it from a distance. It has a slightly different use, obviously. The format of TikTok is very different. It's shorter, it's got different capabilities and what you can do with comments and responses and how you can interact with other users. So it is very much about experimenting with those forms as well as actually logging short snippets of thought and highlighting interesting things I found. But it's there, and I'll figure out how to link to that in this description too, so it's all come together in one place. If not for this imaginary audience, then for me later on when I forget about both accounts somehow. We'll get there anyway. So to Metz, I've been reading some of the second chapter in this book, which he calls Montage or Bust. And the opening idea of this chapter is that the old school of cinema theory, going back to Eisenstein, looking back there's a book from him somewhere, and the Russian director behind Battleship Potemkin and other works like that. Can't name a single other one right now. The theories spouted by Eisenstein at the time were very much about, here is a rule for cinema that I have observed, and it has been tested by a guy whose name started with a K, and it's observable and scientific, and it's a proven rule, and I will use this in my films. Metz compares Eisenstein's very outright theory of having a cinema language, a cinema syntax even, to later theorists, particularly from the Cahiers du Cinéma, the French critical cinema magazine, which hosted a breeding ground of theory in film, particularly for directors that came out of that new wave movement. And he cites a lot of names in there that have got all sorts of works that you will come across if you do any work in film theory. For me, Besson is one that I always seem to collide into. So Metz's first part of this chapter, I've not finished the whole chapter, but I've got a few thoughts from the bits I've read so far. Metz really takes this idea of Eisenstein of saying there's a structure to cinema, and there's this idea of language and form and meaning making that we have, and he compares that to these new wave creators that came much later and say, no, let's go with realism and let's just point cameras at things and let us formulate a story from our own ground. And at one point he cites someone who says, he mentioned an interview with Rossellini, might even have been Rossellini said this, that cinema can be capable of telling stories that are reflective of who I am as a creator, and which are much more raw and endowed with my own personality, rather than following a set pattern of creation. I am an artist doing my own thing, and that could be something completely different. And this person who is making this point, again, possibly Rossellini, compares this to novel writers who have a whole array of forms and of content to draw on and don't have to follow a very specific rule. They do have to use a language, but this is an argument that's saying that cinema isn't a fixed language in that same sense, because they are able to use the form in very different ways to that which is laid out early on by earlier theorists. So I have 3 possibly points. Yes, 3 points. I have typed up passages from this chapter with my own thoughts on them. So I'll go through those one by one, just for my own purposes, to really get them in my head, because these feel very relevant to what I'm talking about or what I want to talk about. So, number one, I'll begin with reading a passage and then I'll talk about my thoughts. So, first of all, it goes into this, or it's a reflection on this interview with Rossellini. And this paragraph begins with, let's say, Rossellini said, "Things are, why manipulate them?" The Soviet filmmaker, Eisenstein, might have replied, "Things are, they must be manipulated." Eisenstein never shows us the course of real events, but always, as he says, the course of real events refracted through an ideological point of view, entirely thought out, signifying from beginning to end. So this is very much the crux of what I was just talking about this idea of structured meaning, which is created and curated by directors, against this idea of naturalism and just letting things play out on camera and presenting a story in its own natural form. And Metz takes this quote from Rossellini and replies to it with what Eisenstein might have used as a reply to it, as a retort even. So that quote again, Rossellini said, "Things are, why manipulate them?" Rossellini is saying there are things for us to see and they are interesting, and why change that? Why put our own stamp on it and take it and cut the images alongside each other in certain ways when actually the interest is for us to watch it unfold? A counterpoint to that Metz suggests would be Eisenstein saying things are, they must be manipulated. Eisenstein wants to tell us a particular story from a particular point of view, and simply just showing us events doesn't allow us doesn't allow us agency as an artist or as a creator of a medium. We are simply documenting in that case. So what is the point? If things are, and we have the ability to document them and present them back to an audience, they must be manipulated if our position in the creator of this content is to have any worth at all. Otherwise, what's the point? So it's naturalism versus montage we're talking about there, but this raises a great question here, which there is a lot of writing already around. Metz was in the 70s here, so this discussion's been going on a long time, and was definitely going a long time before even Metz wrote this book. But that would be, is there art without montage in cinema, particularly in moving image? If we are not selecting the images that we select and putting them alongside other images that we have selected, then is there actually an art form there? Or is this simply just a clear and unaffected recording of the world around us? And we have no value as artists. So bring this forward into the modern age, and we have things like YouTube and TikTok. Shot selection and montage form quite a small part of those things, really. I would argue more on the side of TikTok having a necessity for montage. And in fact, editing one image after another is an integral part of the way that platform in particular works. YouTube maybe not so much, because YouTube has a lot of content quite like exactly this, someone sitting and talking to a camera. Maybe they cut into things to show you something of interest. Maybe they have something to demonstrate a point. Maybe the whole video is actually a demonstration of something that you need to be watching. There are other forms on YouTube, of course, and lots of popular things that involve all sorts of different forms entirely, like comedy sketches and actual narrative content and music videos, all of which have very different philosophies behind them, but all of which can be traced directly back into cinema and perhaps don't actually reflect this as a platform in of itself. It's not specific to YouTube, really. The social side is a bit more specific to YouTube. We can go into like the Web 2.0 arguments and talking about people on the internet, internet citizens, netizens, if you will, but I think that's become a bit problematized in parlance, that word. But either way, these people who are now creating the space that they are sharing, and everyone contributes to it. It's not one thing that we're all consuming, we're all feeding into it. However, if we go into TikTok, that has, in many, many, many cases, montage at its absolute core. On the simplest level, you can record a video and just do one video. That'll do it. Okay. Maybe actually, though, you want to demonstrate a point or something, or you want to demonstrate something in front of us, or you want to show us things, and we get back into the same area that YouTube has been in having that idea of editing there. But there is something very specific, which I don't see a lot of on YouTube, but I imagine exists to a greater extent now. It probably existed before. It's existed on TV for sure. It exists in cinema. But it's absolutely at the core of what a lot of people are using TikTok for. And that is cutting between one person presenting a character and then that person presenting another character. They'll probably face different ways. They might be wearing a hat. It's not a great attempt they're making, though, to really personify a different character. It is merely the idea of montage, that grammar that tells us this is a different character. Just because we've changed from one thing to another, we understand we're looking at something that is not the same thing we were just looking at. In fact, it breaks a very basic rule of cinema, in that it's suppose it's not breaking a rule and is breaking a rule. We've got this 180-degree rule, right, when you're filming with a camera. So if you've got two actors, one facing the other, when you are cutting in to tighter shots on, or you're going from one to the other, even if it's a wide shot going like that, those two people want to be facing the same way across the screen that the audience is watching the whole time. So if one person is looking left, right, whichever way that's coming across on your screen right now, then whenever we cut to a different shot of that person, whether it's closer, further, whether the angle's changed, if the camera's moving, anything, they want to be looking in the same direction. Similarly, the other person should be looking in the opposite direction, but consistently so. This rule is often broken for great effect. There is lots of examples in cinema where this is something that is transgressed for purpose. But it's that old adage of the rules are there to be broken. They are rules, though, and we have them for a purpose. And that purpose is, if it doesn't need to be broken, if you don't need to distance your audience, if you want your audience just to be completely invested in what they're seeing, obey that rule. It just makes sense to the visual eye. So for these TikTok creators to then be sort of breaking that rule and not breaking that rule, and by what I mean is that there's two different characters, so those characters should be facing the same way, but from an objective standpoint, the camera is filming the same object just from a different angle. It's completely disobeying that rule. That is really something interesting, and only the idea, really, I would say, laid down way back in the 20s, 10s, by Eisenstein, of montage allowing us to read across images and construct meaning. That is the only thing that makes that successful and makes that watchable and make that meaningful to us as an audience. We know that they are two separate characters, regardless of the fact it's actually the same person, just facing two different ways. The fact those two images occur side by side, we're following a narrative now, and we know that that's a narrative. So this idea of naturalism versus montage, if we call it, or montage if there is, without montage there is no art. Column A, column B, which is a really lovely place to be when you want to write something academic about it. You can really easily argue both sides of this, but it's valuable, and that's the main thing. I can definitely take that bit of film theory, old film theory in montage, and apply it right up to date in any form that we have. Moving image, whether that be YouTube, TikTok, or anything that emerges, anything that I haven't yet considered. There are so many ways I can use that. And my job now, as I'm thinking of that output, is to create a method for doing that, of saying what is identifiable from these theories that is specifically about the way images move, and take that outside of how a new platform or technology will present a moving image. So good, we're on a good start here. Okay, next paragraph. Here we are. This is from a footnote, interestingly. It feels almost like Metz was just kind of talking to himself here, but he compares a problem he's outlined, which I have to admit I've forgotten what the problem was, but the comparison goes, this is somewhat like the problem of the creator and the theoretician. Despite their closeness in the modern period, talking in the 70s, remember, which, though it has often been pointed out, is still insufficient, who necessarily approach the same object by means that are so different that they are not always able to resist the pessimistic and oversimplifying illusion that it is not the same object. Okay, so first of all, I would say this footnote is a great example of how impenetrable this writing can be sometimes, because there are clauses within clauses and the sentences just go on, and there's all sorts of punctuation. I read one passage this morning that had like an M dash. Thank you, Henna, for teaching me M dash. It had an M dash to a side point, and then when the side point concluded, it restarted the sentence because we'd lost track of what the object was, and then immediately it had a little breakout clause. I don't know what the actual grammatic term is for that in commerce. Another point there, and then oh yeah, the object. So we start the sentence again, and then we got maybe halfway through the sentence before brackets, more information about this background, and then finally ended the sentence. It was about a paragraph of text for one sentence. So that's a huge side note, guys. I'm sorry. But that is just to say a lot of this is going above my head at points because I can't keep track all the time of what actually is being said. So the thing I took away from this paragraph about the problem of the creator and the theoretician is that when this was written, they are quite close. We were in a period of time in the 70s where cinema practitioners and TV practitioners by now as well were also, in some cases, not all whatsoever, but in some cases, the people that were actually coming up with the theories, the people that actually had a very deep academic understanding of film. They weren't just turning up to a studio and doing what they were told because this is what they were told and this is what the studio wants. They were going away and writing articles. They were being published. They are critics. They are looking at other people's films and analyzing them. They are talking to each other. They're huge networks of people at the time. So creator and theoretician was a very close relationship at the time, although Metz does say, it has been pointed out, it was a little insufficient at that point. But the problem they have is that they don't necessarily approach the same object, that is film, without assuming it's the same object they're approaching, essentially, is what is going on here. They approach it differently if they are two different people. A filmmaker and a film theorist would approach a film production from a very different point of view. The practitioner is involved in encoding meaning and making sure they hit some targets in terms of what an audience wants to see, what a studio wants to see, what they want to express artistically. A theoretician is coming from a retrospective standpoint. The product already exists and they are analyzing it, and they don't necessarily know what was going through the filmmaker's mind at the time. They are taking these ideas of theory that they already possess from a bank of film theory that they have learned over time or constructed, and they are pulling apart the product in front of them. And that pulling apart will probably involve a few viewings of the film as well. It is not just going to be a one-off. Maybe there'll be a reactionary piece of writing, an initial reception for the critics, for the papers to say, this is what I think of this film. But if they're pulling it apart on any particular academic level, they're going to be rewatching big chunks of that film. There is quite a large comparison to make here with the media age we're in. Creators and theoreticians, first of all, I would say are much closer today because most people who actually get to make film have to go to some sort of film school at some point. They have to study. A lot of people do come through it from like an apprentice end, and they actually gain work first and then go up through the ranks, and they can do it that way. And there's an argument both sides of which route is better, but ultimately there isn't a lack of people within the industry who have a solid grounding in the academic side of film, meaning that the academic side of film is actually buried a bit deeper into the process of filmmaking these days. Now, take that and move it forward into internet media. And the theoreticians maybe are a bit more removed from there if we're talking about theoreticians as a very specific thing separate to a content creator. People who go and study content, whichever platform it's coming through from the internet, but not specifically cinema, aren't necessarily going to be constructing that content themselves as a career. However, creative consumers are a thing now, is what I would say. To put that very eloquently, they're a thing now. More and more people have access to the technology required to upload moving image content onto the internet in any form, whether it be talking heads and just like look at me talking to a camera, or something a bit more creative, where they've actually deconstructed a set of images and aligned them together in certain ways and used editing and put effects on them and music or whatever you have. Anyway, so in some senses, actually, those people, they have a much closer relationship between what we maybe would call a theoretician and a creative. We can also detach them from being theoretician, though, because those people are much more able just to have a go and just to do it. And the theory is kind of a result of what comes out of those people's efforts. It's up to us to stand on the edges of this, not as the regular contributors to these media, but to analyze what's going on there and to see how they're doing it. So in some ways, actually, we've reverted to the very early days of cinema theory. If we disregard cinema theory, and we're saying this online content requires its own theory, that theory has to come from somewhere. And at the moment, that is coming from people observing it. It's not coming from people who go through training and education into a career in that. So in some ways, maybe we can track the history of cinema and theory, and then track the history of moving image on the internet and the theory that goes with it. And it's quite far behind, which gives me a good, strong talking point at some point in this research to talk about the necessity or the non-necessity for having a trackable point between the two medium, or any medium in between. So if we go via cinema through TV and early internet video and VHS, let's throw that in there a bit earlier, and onto DVD and the home video market, we've got lots of areas where moving image was able to be created, and the theory had to kind of chase and catch up with it. But if it all tracks like cinema did, the theory enters the industry and is now part of it to a lesser or greater extent. Sure, we can say the same about TV. I think the home video market was going that way before it became a little bit redundant, and it was made a bit redundant by internet and the ability we all have now just to put crap like this online for no one to watch. So that will allow me to say, okay, if I'm going to have a framework for how we can apply old theory, should I have a framework for how we can apply old theory, or should every new medium have its brand new sets of old theories? Now, I'm very clearly not on that side. I'm thinking already a lot of people would disagree with that and say, no, clearly we can just use theories that already exist, but find prisms to put them through to view these new things. And it's not a new idea, that one. Those people have had their voices out for quite some time now. A big part of that would be the reading I'm doing around on McLuhan, which is also quite old now. But even for its age, it was already making arguments around, we can reuse old theory. There's no real reason not to. And there are counter arguments. Who was it that said putting old wine in new bottles, or new wine in old bottles? Something like that. Which, yeah, as a sort of simile, makes brilliant sense. And you can be like, yeah, no, that's stupid. Don't do that. But as an actual discussion on whether or not we should do that with media theory and new forms of media, I'm not sure how appropriate that is, because there's a large body of work which is ultimately extremely academic, and in some cases quite far removed from the actual technology at the heart of it. It's talking about some principles that are obviously still going today. That was a really great talking point it gave me there. And I really like the idea of talking between creators, consumers, and theoreticians, or theorists. That would be a better word, right? The last paragraph I'd like to talk about today, then. Okay, let's just go into this one. Many people, misled by a kind of reverse anticipation, have antedated the language system. They believed they could understand the film just because one has understood, whereas one only understands the syntax because one has understood, and only because one has understood the film. The inherent intelligibility of a dissolve or a double exposure cannot clarify the plot of a film unless the spectator has already seen other films in which dissolves and double exposures were used intelligibly. On the other hand, the narrative force of a plot, which will always be understood only too well since it communicates with us images of the world and of ourselves, will automatically lead us to understand the double exposure and the dissolve, if not in the first film we see, then at least by the third or fourth. So this is a really great springboard, really, to talk about the language, which is how this whole endeavor started. I was talking about the language of YouTube, the language of our moving image medium. Is it a language in the strictest sense? Does it exist as a set of grammar and vocabulary and rules? Grammar, rules, whatever. Or is it a bit softer than that? And does it actually require us to reacquire different understandings of it? So to just boil down that example there from Metz, let's take a dissolve. We all know a dissolve, right? Or a crossfade, or whatever you want to call it these days. We have one image, we have another image. Instead of a hard edit between them, one fades into the next. We associate that quite often with things like a dream sequence, maybe a flashback, something that tells us that time or reality is not as straightforward as it usually is in this narrative piece. How do we know that, though? How do we know that that thing that follows that fade is a dream? Is it because we have something hardwired in our evolution, and we understand that? We were born with the understanding that, oh, those images are fading together, this means it's a dream? Or is this something that we've inherited from just exposure to that same technique in that same circumstance, in that same context? I would say yes, almost obviously, because why would we as a human species have evolved anything that tells us how to read a film? The fact that there are books called How to Read a Film, there it is just above my head. I talked about that in another video. The fact those books exist tell us that we need to learn those things and that they aren't just an inherent part of us, which also says then that cinema is not an inherent language. It is not a formal structured language in the same sense that English is. If I want to communicate to you in English and I want to be understood, I have to follow some rules. I have to use a clear set of vocabulary that I know you will understand, and I have to arrange it in the correct manner so that you find it appropriate. If I was to say the sentence again, but I just decided to put all the words in that sentence in a different order, it would lose all meaning. You'd maybe get the gist of something I'm talking about. You get like a context idea of the subject I'm on, but you wouldn't be able to understand the point I'm trying to make. The thoughts that I am processing in my head into language and then into speech do not come across clearly unless I follow the rules of language to do that. Cinema does not have that same rule. It doesn't have a formal set of meaning that is universal to everyone. Instead, it relies on people reusing tropes, essentially, in taking a convention or taking a new idea and making it a convention just through repetition. And it's not necessarily one person or one team or one film responsible for that repetition, but it is in fact a set of films or a set of teams, a set of people to reuse that across different productions so that we have this global approach to creating a language within cinema. Now, part of that is interesting because it means that that global approach to creating language could change at any moment. Historically, we've had these meanings attached to fades, but suddenly they could come to mean something completely different. And in fact, you could use them for almost anything you wanted to within a film and not really worry about how an audience is going to take that because, as Metz says, the narrative of the film you're watching has a much clearer drive for meaning. You're going to get that through that film, and the story is going to unfold in front of you, regardless of cinema language, any use of techniques to dress it up and make different meanings in there. The language the actors are speaking and the images you see relate to something in your direct human experience that you are able to understand. So if you don't fully understand what the director was trying to say with the choices they made, and therefore maybe the larger thematic content of the film, you will understand what happened because people are saying things. If you're able to understand people saying things, you're able to get what happened, basically. Maybe you'll see some images that make no sense, but the words people are saying will be able to rectify that for you. Think of Avengers. There are some images in Avengers movie which make zero sense. Who is that giant purple guy with the wiggly chin? What's he doing in this place that he's in that was full of grass a moment ago, but now is not full of grass, it's full of rubble and fire. Well, the things people are saying around him and the actions that people are taking show him to be antagonistic and show him to be against us. And the fire that was coming out of the sky, right, okay, I understand that is responsible for the damage. We get to understand these things, not through lived experience, but through common experience. We can see these things around us. If they put a fade in there, maybe someone who's watched at least a couple of films would be like, oh, this maybe isn't a real bit, or this is a potential feature, or this is a flashback, or this could mean something completely different. Maybe we're going to see the multiverse early or something. But ultimately that fade could happen and have no resolution to it, and it wouldn't change the plot of the film, basically. So to say cinema has a language is kind of a cheat. It's a bit of a loose definition of language. It has a language, but only a language that you're able to read if you've exercised your reading of it. If you've seen films before, you're more likely to be able to read the film, but not in the same way that if you've read books before, you're more able to read books in the future. That's true to an extent, but only because of your grasp of the language books are written in. If a book was to use English, but in a way I mentioned earlier, where it jumbled all the words around, then you could read all the books you want. That will never become clearer. Okay, so what we really are talking about here is a language in cinema that simultaneously reconstructs itself over and over again and requires us to reacquire it over and over again. So this is not a fixed language, but in fact it's a changeable language, and we are all able to understand it after exposure to it. It's not something that we can do to watch, as Metz says again, to watch a film one time and come away saying, I understand that film completely. It requires rewatching. It requires us to really understand that film. We only understand that film completely if we've already seen the film from start to end, and we know what all the messages are. We know what the plot is. We know what the themes are. We can't really start to fathom the choices a director, an actor, an editor makes until after we have the whole film in its completion within our heads, because then we can retrospectively say, oh, right, I see why they're making that choice. I understand that actually that gives me a slightly different reading. I can apply to it now. I can say that actually this film was not going for this kind of aesthetic, but it was going for that kind of aesthetic because this character is unstable, and this film is reflecting that character's psyche. Earlier, I just didn't know what was going on. But we didn't learn the character was unstable till right at the end when they killed their mother, something along those lines. So there's no inherent language in the medium, and there's no clear syntax, which is something I can take and talk about in the more modern platforms again, because evidently there are things that are identical to the languages that cinema has constructed and required us to learn. So too have online videos in any format. I would say let's take a Davey 504 example from YouTube. If he's sad, rain in front of the screen turns blue, a very brief bit of sad music. What's happening, Davey 504? What is that? I know, because I've seen your videos before, and you're sad at those points, and that's just a shorthand to say you're sad. Go to TikTok and we understand just what I was saying earlier, one character one side talking to another character the other side, irregardless that they're the same person. I have seen how TikTok works. I've seen these videos before. It's just a new take on a convention that's been established within this medium. I've got that now. Your language is constructed through repetition. Cool. Okay. This has been a really useful chat to myself, I think. I've got a lot from this and a lot of ideas to work with, and I've got my notes typed up. I'm raring to go with this. So I'm going to end it there for today. That's quite a long one, and I'll sort out those things in the description what I said. Okay, cheers.